Hey, Seema. Hey, Seema.
This is
I'm
such good
everywhere.
news.
I'm everywhere.
But you should have told us ahead of
I
time.
know. I was like, oh, everything's been going so fast. But it's okay.
Because I'm not sure, I wasn't sure if I could connect, and I'm not sure I'll be able to stay for the
It'll be on YouTube. This will be recorded and it'll be accessible on YouTube. Oh, so I think once it's on YouTube, I'll definitely share it with our class.
Wonderful.
You know, I'm like so excited.
Will it be how long, more or less?
Around an hour.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. It'll be around an hour. Okay.
My audio is not good.
Can you hear me clearly? Can everyone hear me clearly?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Hi, Darryl. So exciting.
I'm very, very excited. This has been like quite literally an obsession of mine. As I see Dan Thompson is here. Dan Thompson will attest for this obsession of mine. I'll do a little introduction. So hello everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Darryl Smith, and I am an artist primarily working in Renaissance materials. I'll be teaching a class next month called Renaissance Principles, where I'll walk you through creating an oil painting, using all traditional materials, making our own paint from scratch, and using other types of Renaissance drawing techniques and materials such as silver paint, red chalk, and charcoal and ink. And my own work, I primarily use silver point and egg tempera, and my work deals a lot within the Greco-Roman world. Besides being interested in the stories of the Greco-Roman world, I'm also interested in the language of the Greco-Roman world. With that comes so many different types of opportunities. Being interested primarily in figurative art, I started to really study anatomy for its grammar. I found that the grammar of the body basically really, really helps me. And
Excuse me, could we ask for everyone to mute?
Yeah,
there's a clicking.
Yeah, let me go through. Perfect. Okay. I love the Greco-Roman language, Greek and Latin primarily. And so studying anatomy, when I first started studying anatomy, I didn't really know how to really grasp anatomy until I started to actually bring in my language background into play, into the art. And I realized there's a lot of opportunities there to really grasp and understand anatomy kind of in the linguistic aspect of it. But I also realized while I was doing that, it helps in the art too. So this lecture will kind of be about how the body can be used as a language and how language has influenced the use of the body. Let me start my lecture. So, body as a language, history and development of anatomical terminology. This is, I guess, this is kind of like my artistic philosophy. I feel like since we communicate verbally and with words, we are just as capable of communicating visually. And if art, is a way of communicating something, whether it's a narrative or not, we could think of art in the same way, and I think we use the body in the same way, and we can kind of take that language aspect kind of very literally. And so I think that's why we use anatomy, really. I think studying anatomy is like a way of learning how we can express ourselves visually with this new and exciting grammar. And it's a journey. It's a lifelong journey, but it's super beautiful and fun. And I think there are a lot of different avenues to explore anatomy. And I'd like to talk about the father of anatomy himself. And his name is Claudius Golonis, or Galen as we call him. He was born in Pergamon in the year 129 AD or CE. He basically coined all the terms that we use today, and they really just haven't changed. And I find that very interesting. So I started to kind of look into that further. Galen is an ancient Greek physician who worked primarily in the Roman Empire, and he was really famous for being the physician of Marcus Aurelius, as well as two successors in the Roman Empire. And he's known as the father of anatomy. And he wrote like so many treatises, I don't know how to pronounce that word, but he wrote so much about anatomy, physiology, psychology even, and he felt that, in order to be a physician or a doctor, you also had to be a great philosopher. And so because of that, he wrote on so many different topics, and most of them are lost now, but what we do have has been translated and saved through translations in Arabic and Latin, mostly Arabic, actually. And though most of the words that we use to describe the body today in anatomical terms are mostly Greek and Latin, I have come across a couple. There's a sprinkling of ones that are actually from Arabic, and one of them is nuca, like the nuchal ligament. It looks very Greek, but it's actually an Arabic word meaning the spinal cord. But then the Latin purists came in and were like, actually, we're going to take that. But I think that's really interesting, just to know how far and wide just this the scholarship of anatomy has gone. One thing to note about Galen, though, is that because he was in the Roman Empire, it was very shunned upon and illegal to dissect the human body. So most of his all of his writings really, all of his writings were about pigs or dogs or apes. He even writes about like apes being closer to the human form, so I'm going to dissect apes. This is why. But he also is kind of gung-ho about the study of anatomy, and he always recommends, don't just read the books. You should go out there and study the bones in person, look at them. Don't just read about them. And he actually writes out, he's like, don't even just read my books. Just go out there and do the thing and study the anatomy in person. And I thought that was really interesting because I had that same experience studying anatomy most of my undergrad, so about 4 years, until I went to the dissection lab, and then everything changed. And seeing it in person really makes things click. And, unfortunately, Galen didn't have access to human cadavers for anatomical and scientific purposes, but he made it work. Some of his treatises are here. The one that I actually have is called On Anatomical Procedures, and I'm slowly chipping away at that book. It's really interesting. I like the ideologies that he puts into that book, one of them being, studying anatomy from life, and primarily studying the bones. Bones are really important. But yeah, this is just like a small list of the capabilities and writings that he's done. Now, after Galen, mind you, Galen so he died in like the year 200. And, after that you have like the medieval, blah, blah, blah. What's really interesting is that for about 1,300 years, his writings and philosophy and studies on anatomy were not challenged at all. They were the standard for 1,300 years. That's a very, very long time. And the person to challenge him was Andreas Vesalius, who was a Flemish-born anatomist and doctor who wound up studying in Paris, and then he taught at the University of Padua, which is still today. And he studied Galenic anatomy, meaning studying anatomy by way of not dissecting humans, but dissecting animals and like pets. But he later realized, Vesalius realized that no, this is not correct. Like that's not how it's done. How about we, it would make more sense to dissect humans if we're going to talk and write about humans, So that's what Galen did, and he has like a really stern picture of him staring into our soul, with a casual flayed arm with no gloves. It's gross, but he is known for his book called De Humani Corporis Fabrica Libris Septem, which means the 7 books on the structure and fabrication of the human body. This is commonly known as just Fabrica. And this is the cover of it. You can access, this is cool, you can access the original scanned version of this book in Latin. It's all in Latin. I think it's by the University of Basel, which is where the book was printed in like 15 something. He was like 29 years old when he printed this, 29. It's insane. So that's him surrounded by a ton of people in an open cadaver and skeleton. But this is like revolutionary, what he's doing. And it's cool to see even what Vesalius writes in terms of his own findings and correcting Galen, or even siding with Galen, being like, oh, well, Galen said this, I also agree, or, well, this doesn't exist here. Galen said this, but Galen's wrong. And all this stuff is happening in Latin, translated from the original Greek. And again, those are just the same words we use today. So about the book Fabrica, it was the first comprehensive textbook of anatomy. There's 7 books. 2 of them, the first one goes over bones, and the second one goes over muscles. But then there's ones that go over like veins and arteries and organs and the whole 9 yards. But the first 2 books, for our purposes as artists, I think are the most important. And we're probably familiar, at least I've seen them on my end, the illustrations in this book. I thought they were done by Vesalius himself. They were not. They were done by the studio of Titian, and one of the artists possibly is Jan Sievend van Kalkar, who is a Flemish or German artist. But this is one of them, but I love the illustrations. They're very dramatic, very They're very Italian in terms of the, you know, like this background, a landscape casually. But I think even seeing the body outside of what we're used to of being like the traditional anatomical reference pose, seeing it out of that creates, there's a lot of life in there. And I feel that even through the words and incorporating that life into these illustrations is really important in terms of anatomical study. And throughout the book, the body would like slowly decay. So here's one of them to the left. And I don't know if you've seen these illustrations, but like over the course of time, it'll just flay more sections of the figure and more sections of the figure, and everything's labeled. Sorry. Let's not do that. So everything is labeled here. And I was really interested in this because the book that I have by Galen does not have any illustrations. It's just all words. So I was really curious to see how these muscles and bones were labeled. And they're more or less the same today. So it's just a combination now, the anatomical terminology that we use today is just Galen's words and corrections by Andreas Vesalius. And besides like the sprinkling of like the Arabic words here and there, it's all in Greek and Latin. And just from those names, we can learn a lot though. And I was curious about that. Just by studying the name alone, we can learn about the shape of the muscle or bone, the convexity or concavity, the size, the origin and insertion. Some muscles tell you where their origin is and where their insertion is. Sternocleidomastoid is one of them. Iliocostalis is another. The location, pectoralis, on the chest, it means chest muscle. Fiber direction, for example, longissimus is one. Longissimus is a very long muscle on your spine, and the fibers do that same exact thing. They just kind of follow vertically up the spine. And function. Function is a like pronator teres, the round muscle that turns the arm is what it translates to. And I found that really interesting because just by kind of knowing and studying these names, you can read the body literally like a book. And this page here I found really interesting. I think I have a picture of that later. But this is this part up here where it says D. It says, starting from like here, it basically says like he's describing the pelvis, but there's no word for pelvis yet. So the way they describe the pelvis is by describing the three parts of the pelvis: the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis right there. And when I was studying anatomy, I often heard of the pelvic bone being called the like innominate bone, and I really didn't know what that meant. And I was confused as to why it was called the innominate bone until I started reading this, and they just call it the bones next to the sacrum. And I thought that was, for me, really interesting to see. Some words of wisdom by our dear friend Galen. This is basically what I was talking about earlier. Since therefore the form of the bone is assimilated, the form of the body is assimilated to the bones, to which the nature of other parts correspond, I'll have you first gain an exact and practical knowledge of human bones. Basically, form follows function and bones before muscles. Studying the bones is super crucial because, muscles attach to the bones, but just the general, even superficial forms of the body are still mitigated by the bone structure underneath. And then understanding the bone structure I feel can help you then invent poses and kind of, sometimes I'll use like the stick figure approach with the bones and kind of get that architecture going. And through that architectural understanding of the figure, both, in an architectural sense and a structural sense, but also architecturally in terms of the grammar and the linguistical sense, it's really interesting to see how those two can be combined together. And with the names, what I noticed, the main thing that we're given names are bones. And I think that's, for me, really interesting because, again, bones being structural and muscles just follow the bones. Muscles are more of a descriptive quality. So one doesn't just name the muscle, we have to describe the muscle. And that's basically how Galen and Vesalius talked about the muscles. They didn't really have, a set name like, we kind of coin it today, like gastrocnemius, meaning like the belly of the knee or something like that, or the serratus muscle, meaning like the combed, the serrated muscle, or for example, another good one is like rectus abdominis. That just means the muscle that goes straight down the abdominals. And just saying it like that is very descriptive. And for example, like Galen, who was really revolutionary for his time for writing about anatomy for the first time and dissecting, though they're animals, for the first time, he's not really coining a word, but instead he's more or less describing just what he sees. And I think as artists, we're really good at that. And with the muscles, I think just by describing its location, shape, and action in the same way we would draw like its shape, we always reduce things to shapes. I think those two things are quite the same. One example here is all of that highlight, well, from this red bracket to that red bracket is how Galen describes the extensor digitorum communis of the hand. That's a lot of words, but again, he's describing the location of it. He calls it the muscle in the middle of the lower arm on the outside, for being continuous with itself and single in a strict sense. It is split at the wrist into 4 tendons, producing a uniform movement, each extending the relevant finger. Now, just by saying that, you can kind of envision more or less what this muscle's doing, even though you haven't been given a proper name specifically on what it's called. You just know that, where it's located. It's a larger muscle that splits. Here Galen's describing that, well, though a muscle may seem like it's separate because it splits into many tendons, most of the times it's probably one muscle. This is why. And so he describes this muscle, and he always uses this type of terminology. And I think that's really, for me, beautiful, because when I go and draw the arm, I'm not really thinking more or less of the name, like extensor digitorum. I'm not really thinking of that. I'm more thinking of, where does this middle muscle begin, and how does it split up into the digits of your fingers? And how can I play with that in terms of creating a pose? And I think the way Galen is describing this muscle with literal language, I like to use visual language to describe those same muscles. And this is the other one about the pelvis, it being described not as a whole, but as 3 parts. you know, pelvis means bucket in Latin. So when I draw the pelvis, I do think of that bucket structure. But it's also really interesting to, once you start to take the bucket and kind of break it apart, how do you really break that apart into 3 different structures? And we can see that here, that's how it's just being described as, you know, the muscle next to the sacrum, like right here. This day ossibus, this means on the bone, about the bones that are connected to the side of the sacrum, is what that title means. And that's, you know, long-winded. But I feel like that sort of descriptive quality is really, it's luscious, and using that in whether we're drawing, painting, or sculpting is quite interesting. But now it's like, okay, I get that, you know, we're ascribing names to bones and then muscles are, you know, just being described by their shape. But how do we use this as artists is the big question. I think once the bones and muscles are taken out of that Greek and Latin context, there's a conceptual and structural approach to understanding the body. And I feel like just with that conceptual understanding, we can put a lot of life into our figures. We could put souls into our figures when we draw them. And as we reduce things to shapes, we can start to see how there are different shapes and patterns within the body, in the same way where probably Galen or Vesalius found that they're very similar types of forms within the body, and they just describe it. They don't necessarily have to pinpoint and name it, but just in the act of describing, they create a more both linguistically beautiful and visually beautiful understanding of the body. Here are a couple of bony landmarks that just some translation, I have muscles soon. The upper arm bone is the humerus, the chest bone, the sternum. The sternum, let me tell you. Okay, so in terms of this conceptual understanding of the body, when we draw, for example, the rib cage, the thoracic cage, whatever we want to call it, we like to think of an egg. But as I started to kind of look at the names even of the bones on and around the rib cage, I started to realize that there is a common theme going on there. It's kind of like a gladiator, like warrior suit. That's kind of how I like to think about the rib cage, or even call it a cage, right? What's the cage protecting? Well, our organs, our heart, you know, very vital. And so, yes, the egg shape on the surface is great, but also thinking of it as a cage really helps. So then you have the sternum. Sternum, it means chest bone, but then what if we break apart the sternum in the same way that Vesalius broke apart the pelvis? If we don't give the sternum the name sternum, what do we have? Well, we have the manubrium, the handle of the sword. We have the gladiolus, the little sword. And then we have the xiphoid process, a protrusion that looks like a sword or a little dagger. So with that like gladiator sort of suit going on, and then the sword right in the middle of the chest, that conceptually, I think, is a really powerful way of understanding the rib cage. And then you have the sternum being in the center axis of the body, and that could be kind of flow throughout the entire figure, whether you're doing like a gesture. That's something that I really like to do, is find that main gestural line, both connecting the spine and the sternum, since they both exist on the central axis of the body. Then you have your axis and atlas vertebrae that are also on your spine. And then you have your sacrum, also at the end of your spine, and all of these points are connected through a fluid line. And for me, that's kind of how I like to see the body. And then the spine, that's another one. There's so many spines in the body. Spine meaning thorn. And just even thinking about the word thorn as an image when I'm drawing, let's say I'm drawing the back of a figure, and I do see that the spine is starting to protrude out of the form, and the light will hit it in a really great way. How do I go about rendering the spine? I don't really want to, I don't think about spine as a concept. I start to think of thorn as a concept. And when I start to reduce and think about, the spine going down the back in terms of like little thorns, I think that would be, that creates a really lively way of really activating that back. Another bone and bony landmark, the crow beak, the protrusion that looks like a crow beak, that's on that and the glenoid fossa groove that looks like an eyeball. That's on both of those on the scapula. And scapula meaning shoulder blade. And for me, when I think about that eyeball shape and how that humerus bone kind of like locks in there, I can then start to compare, for example, the glenoid fossa to like the acetabulum in the pelvis, the vinegar cup. Those two kind of have very similar functions in terms of why these grooves exist in the body. Another bone, the Navicularis bone, that's in the foot, shaped like a boat. And then one of my favorites, the hyoid bone, is shaped like the Greek letter he or high, this little lowercase u shape, and that's like right underneath underneath your chin, kind of around your neck area. The muscles, here's a couple of muscle names. The big round muscle, teres major. That's really interesting because when we draw a really muscular model from the back, we can start to see these round areas right at the end of the scapula. We can see these really round areas right at the end of the scapula. And thinking about the teres major, both in its, its trajectory going to the front of the humerus, but also if we think about the word teres meaning round, we can start to really accentuate how we start to render this form right underneath or at the end of the scapula. And then with that latissimus dorsi kind of hugging the teres major, almost like a hammock, and having that kind of thin sheet going over. But I really think about that teres major form specifically because it's big and it's round. And talking about the latissimus dorsi, if there's a latissimus, if there's a latitude, there's a longitude, basically. So if there's a latissimus dorsi, there's going to be a longissimus dorsi. There's going to be, if there's a longitude, there's a latitude. So, and if there's like a major, there's a minor. If there's a big, there's a small. If there's a large, there might be a medium, and there might be a small. And just with those linguistic ideas there, they translate very well once we start to put them into the context of anatomical studies and when we're drawing and painting and sculpting the figure. I mentioned earlier the iliocostalis, along with the longissimus, are part of the erector spinae, meaning, groups of muscles that lift up the spine. And architecturally, it's really great to think about those muscles, because as we're drawing them, sorry, there's someone in the chat. Yes. As we're, as if we think about if we think about the erector spinae as not just the name erector spinae, but a group of muscles whose job is to lift up the spine and connect all the way to the head, there's going to be an architectural element that's going to be in play. And so we'll know that, around the ilium bone, we're going to have kind of a thicker mass, because we think of it like a column almost. Even the spine itself is similar to a column, in that as it gets wider down to the sacrum, the actual vertebrae get larger and larger. And that's very similar to the structural or the architectural structure of a Doric column. So thinking about those ideas in a structural way, just by way of the language, really helps, again, when inventing a pose. And you'll know if something feels architecturally sound, if it feels like it's really lifting up the spine and holding up the weight of the head, or twisting around in the way it's supposed to. A couple of other muscles that are, for me, really interesting: deltoid. Anything that ends in oid, by the way, another linguistic aspect, means to look like. So deltoid means looks like the letter delta. Mastoid means like it looks like a breast or a chest. Styloid means it looks like a stylus or a sharpened pencil. Hyoid, again, looks like the Greek letter. What's another one? Rhomboid looks like a rhombus. Trapezoid looks like a trapezoid, like a table, really. Are there any more oids? It'll come to me. Then we have the biceps, the two-headed muscle, and there are two-headed muscles, one in the arm, one in the leg. The sandal muscle, the soleus, underneath the gastrocnemius on your lower leg. And thinking about that sandal shape really helps kind of accentuate the shape of the leg, both when seen from the front and kind of when seen from the back and side. These are ways that I personally like to use anatomy and the language. So one example is zygomatic. It's that green bone there, and we know the zygomatic kind of attaching to your ear in the back of your head and going up towards your frontalis bone and around your eye. But the word zygomatic comes from the word yoke. And I think of this picture of a yoke. It's a device that you hook around a cow's neck to kind of attach it to the pulley that's going to be used when they kind of go around the farm and stuff. So that idea, though, of this bone hooking the back of your head more or less to the front, and that structural aspect helps me really start to place in the orbicularis oris. No, that's the mouth. The eye muscles. Let's call it the eye muscles. It'll help me place the eyes. It'll also help me think about how the mouth muscles and the zygomaticus and the risorius and all that stuff, how all of those are kind of being placed on this structure that does this really good job of connecting the front and the back of your skull by way of the sides. That's one of my favorites. Another one of my favorite, oh my God, this is my favorite one, okay. So the olecranon, this used to always trip me up because I used to call the arm no man's land because it's really complicated. But after kind of thinking about the arm, not only in the functional sense of, just kind of drawing it and whatnot, when I started to think about the the language used to describe, for example, the bones, it really started to click. One of them being the elbow. The elbow is a part of your ulna. It's the thicker part of your ulna attaching to the end of your humerus, your upper arm bone. And the word olecranon is the anatomical term for elbow. But if we break that word apart, it is the cranium or the head of your oleni, which is a Greek word, which is where we get the word ulna from. So it kind of can be seen as like the cranium almost of your ulna. If your ulna had like a cranium, just like the top of your head, though the actual head of your ulna is towards your wrist. But I like to think about that kind of cranium aspect of your ulna for the elbow. And so when I start to draw the arm in any complicated position, if I can find that elbow, that means I've located the ulna. If then from then we can extrapolate everything else about the arm essentially. And then opposite of that is like radius. Radius turns. Therefore, as it turns, it's creating a bulge. As it turns, the muscle mass with it. And that goes around the ulna, and the ulna doesn't really move at all. Oh, yes, this is another one. I had a bit of a revelation with the relationship between the leg and the arm while in the dissection lab, drawing the arm. I spent like a semester just drawing arms because I really wanted to understand this no man's land, but then I started to also break it apart linguistically and find a lot of similarities. Trochanter, that large bone on the femur connecting into the acetabulum on the pelvis, and trochlea, which is the bone protrusion at the end of the humerus, and that's where the ulna connects to. Both of those words come from the Greek word trecho, which means to run. Now, when we bend our knee and when we flex our arm, we are essentially using that same kind of pulley system to activate that movement. As we flex our arm and bend our knee, basically bending our knee when we run is flexing our leg. So when I started to think about just those two similarities, I really did start to break apart the different structures of all the bones in the upper and lower extremity and seeing if they had any differences or similarities, and they have a lot of similarities. So if we look at this image and just kind of match the colors to each other, they pretty much relate 100% to each other in terms of both form and function, except for the fibula, because our lower extremity, especially in our lower leg, because we need that kind of structural vertical element to hold ourselves up, as well as like the shock absorbers in our foot, we cannot move our fibula in the same way that we can move our radius, or else that would really hurt and probably not be safe. But and I would even argue, like the same way we bend our knee and flex our arm, that patella right there, even though that patella is a floating bone, I feel like it has a structural similarity to the olecranon, in that this is kind of that bony protrusion right at the crux of that bending movement, in the same way that we would bend our legs. And then sometimes even the names are the same or they rhyme, like metacarpals, metatarsals, and the phalanges are both the same here, meaning kind of like lined up flanks in an army, because the bones are lined up one after another. But even looking at some of these characteristics, for example, the humerus connects into this kind of ball and socket joint here by way of this tubercle on the head of the humerus, just as the ball of the femur connects into the socket joint in the pelvis. And there's the greater trochanter here, this curved area. And as it goes further towards the end of the bone, it gets wider. And at the end of the femur, it's curved. And this is the same aspect here at the end of the humerus, which also gets wider at the bottom. So it gets wider at the bottom, and it curves too from the side. And the ulna, we could think about the ulna and the radius, especially this little tip right here, the styloid processes on both the ulna and the radius. And we can feel those on our hand if you kind of take your wrist and kind of pinch the two sides or hold the two sides and kind of move it down until you feel like a really kind of bony protrusion. That's going to be the styloid process. That area, if we were to compare that to the lower extremity, those are our lateral medial malleoli, aka the ankles. So we can think about the ankles now in the same way we can think about the styloid process in our hand. And that kind of really helps me from there figure out how the tarsal bones are connecting to the tibia in the same way the carpal bones are connecting to the radius and the ulna. And what else? Yeah, I just find it like really fascinating, those little tidbits in the body that for me, I feel like I've kind of grasped a little bit more when I started to really think not only about the form and the function, but how the language kind of carries over into play when we start to think about the body and the muscle movements and muscle shapes and whatnot. But as per the words of Galen, I really start to understand these things more after studying the bones. The bones, especially even just looking at this picture, when I started to understand more the bones of the lower extremity here on the left, and then placing the muscles on top of that, I really started to understand how the muscles moved with the upper extremity on the arm. One good example actually is the gluteus maximus. The gluteus maximus and gluteus medius can be compared to the deltoid. They're large muscle mass that covers up protruding bone area. Namely, the gluteus maximus will cover up the greater trochanter, and the deltoid would cover up the humerus. And when you draw the model and you're drawing the lower extremity, sometimes you'll see what will happen is the gastrocnemius, no, the gluteus maximus muscle and gluteus medius muscle, they'll kind of spiral into the divot that's created by the greater trochanter. So you see this little depression and shadow. And if we think of the upper extremity being the opposite of whatever really happened with the lower extremity, on the deltoid, what will happen, instead of you seeing a divot, you'll actually start to see a highlight on where the humerus bone pops out, governing the form of the deltoid. So that's one way I kind of like to think about taking the language of these language of the bones, translating them into the forms and functions of the muscles, and then how we could compare and contrast them throughout the entire body. And for me, that really helps with understanding, especially really difficult poses or inventing poses. If we, start from the structural box form, because the box is always great, but then after that box form, thinking about the other conceptual and structural details within the body, and then kind of really building it up almost like, Frankenstein in this case. And I find that understanding anatomy in this linguistic aspect has kind of really helped when I do go in and draw the figure. I can extrapolate a lot more and I can invent a lot more. And if the model like changes or something like that, there's lots of information now that I've gathered in order to kind of make up my own story quite literally in terms of how I'm reading the body from top to bottom. And I think in these last couple of minutes, I'd love to know if anyone has any questions. I love questions. Or any concerns or any ideas that you have about language and anatomy and the body in general. You could type it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and just speak out. I am here. I'm here for you. Any questions? No?
I have a question.
Yes.
I don't know. I just am very interested in like the last point you made about the parallels between the different parts of the body. Because I found that actually helps me understand anatomy a lot more when I'm able to see, if I'm able to fully understand one part, and then, when you use the analogy of the gluteus maximus being a part of the deltoid, like I didn't think of that in that manner. Like I can tell like the parallels between the arm and the leg and like what you were first going into, but even within the muscles and their insertions and things like that, like there's similarities and differences are things that I've been super interested in. I'm glad that you kind of touched on it.
Yeah, again, starting with Galen, form follows function, and then, muscles are really just mitigated by the forms of the bones. And since they didn't really have names for these muscles, but they had names for these bones, and these structural bones are just structural elements. And so if there's similarities in structural elements, I would also kind of assume that there would be similarities and descriptive qualities of how the muscles fall on top of the same sort of structure, if that makes sense. And then when I started to kind of think about, like, for example, the trochlea in our humerus and the trochanter in our leg, I really started to break that apart and think about that super literally. And as I started, and for me, I'm more familiar with the leg, or more comfortable, let's say, with the leg, right? And just by kind of studying those muscles, but I'm studying them not just for their shape. I'm primarily looking at their function and their location, and seeing if there's anything else that will kind of help me understand where these aspects exist. For example, the quadriceps could be like the triceps, the ligament on the tricep going down to the olecranon, and maybe the aconius. That could be similar to the ligament of or the tendon rather of the quadriceps going over the patella, and the patellar ligament going down into the tibia. or tibial tuberosity. So that's one idea. And even thinking about, for example, if you go back to the tibia and fibula means brooch or like a safety pin. So we can think about how structurally sound that area has to be just by nature of its name. But then we can also see how different it is from our radius, because the radius, the word itself does not mean anything related to stability. In fact, it means movement in a circle. So that's a cool way to think about that. What's another cool one? You know, there's a retinaculum on your foot in the same way there's a retinaculum on your hand, on your wrist. There's probably a similarity between the tibialis anterior and the extensor carpi ulnaris, maybe. But I think that, and you can just pick that apart. But I think going from what you're familiar with, in the same way one would kind of read in a language that they're more familiar with, or reference something in a language that they're more familiar with. It's kind of like a thesaurus in a way. By kind of finding those two similarities, you can really then start to really understand the body conceptually, but then start to understand it really formally. And then just from that, you can really invent whatever you'd like. But I think it creates a more sound understanding of the body, thinking it through, not only an artistic approach, but also a linguistic approach. It's really fun. And I love to play the game of like, oh, what type of muscle is equal to what other muscle, and why, why is it so? Then I really start to break it apart and be like, oh, this is like this because of this, or well, because this is here, then that means there must be another one here. Like if there's like an abductor longus pollicus, there must be an abductor pollicus brevis. If there's a long, there's a short somewhere. And we may or may not see it in its superficial form, but just at least knowing that that form exists somewhere. For example, if there's a tibialis anterior, there's probably a tibialis posterior. And it's going to be a more of an internal form that we may not see. Maybe it will bring out some of the superficial form, maybe in the same way that the erector spinae muscles do on the back. Then you have the cap muscles of the trapezius and the latissimus dorsi. So there's lots of different ways to really kind of break it apart, like a language. And I think we artists are really good at that, translating all that visually. It's super, I think it's just super cool. It's again, lifelong obsession. It's just a blast, really, but it has really helped me kind of grasp like a better understanding of how I look at the body. Yes, you're welcome, Dan. Anatomy is life, y'all. It really is. It's so fun. Does anyone else have any last minute questions, concerns, ideas, revelations? Well, I thank you all so much for joining me today as we talk about language and anatomy and how we can bridge this gap to create the ultimate visual communication and visual language. And I look forward to hopefully seeing some of your faces in my Renaissance Principles class. Ooh. But otherwise, enjoy the rest of your evening. Peace out.
Thank you.
Very welcome.